I remember the exact temperature of the air on Vectrus Prime the morning they issued us the Mk7 environment suits. 22 degrees Celsius. A breeze came off the northern forests, carrying the scent of something like pine, but sharper, more resinous. The sky was pale blue, almost white at the horizon. I had been in the Guard for 3 years, 2 months and 14 days. I was 21 standard years old. I did not know that this would be the last time I would ever breathe unfiltered air. The planet was contested. The reports used that word specifically. Contested, not invaded, not occupied. As if the world itself was debating which side to join. Chaos forces had made planetfall in the southern continent 6 weeks before our regiment arrived. The cogitators estimated their strength at 40,000 combatants, though the number fluctuated in the reports. Our orders were simple in their phrasing. Secure the primary hive cities, eliminate hostile presence, maintain imperial authority. Standard pacification protocol. I stood in the mustering yard with 11,000 other soldiers while the quartermaster sergeants distributed the suits. They came in reinforced plasteel crates, each one stenciled with hazard warnings and purity seals. The seals were fresh enough that I could still smell the wax. The sergeant who handed me mine, a man named Corvell with a scar that bisected his left eyebrow, told me to check the integrity seals before wearing it. He said this while looking at a data slate, not at me. His breath smelled like recaf and nutrient paste. The suit was heavier than I expected. 14 kilograms of rubberized fabric, reinforced joints, integrated rebreather systems, and triple-layer filtration. The helmet sealed with a pressurized hiss that I would come to know more intimately than my own heartbeat. Inside, the air tasted like recycled nothing. Sterile, flat, slightly metallic. The heads-up display flickered to life across the interior visor. Atmospheric composition, suit integrity at 100%, oxygen reserves at 14 hours, exterior temperature, radiation levels. They told us the enemy had biological weapons. They told us we had countermeasures. They told us the suits would keep us safe. What they did not tell us, what perhaps they did not know, or chose not to say, was that both sides had already made the same calculation. That the atmosphere itself had become a weapon we would all deploy. That the planet was already dead. It simply had not stopped moving yet. I learned about the Life Eater virus in the briefing 3 days before the first deployment. A tech priest with more augmetics than flesh delivered the information in a voice that buzzed with vox distortion. The virus was an Imperial sanction-level weapon, he explained, designed to reduce organic matter to base compounds in a process of catastrophic cellular breakdown. Exposure resulted in death within seconds. Complete atmospheric saturation could consume a planet's biosphere in hours. The decomposition process released sufficient heat to ignite atmospheric oxygen. I remember thinking, with a clarity that comes before understanding, that it seemed excessive for a contested world. That if we were here to secure the planet, destroying all life seemed counterproductive. I did not voice this observation. I had learned in 3 years of service that questions about strategic doctrine were not encouraged from soldiers of my rank. The man next to me in the briefing was named Terrans. He had transferred into our company 2 months prior, a thin man with nervous hands that were always moving, checking his equipment, adjusting his uniform. He leaned close and whispered, "They wouldn't actually use it though, would they? Not while we're down there." His breath was sour with anxiety. I did not answer him. I was watching the tech priest's fingers, 3 biological, 4 mechanical, manipulate the hololith display, showing simulated dispersal patterns, atmospheric saturation times, casualty projections rendered in red vectored lines. The numbers were precise. Millions, rendered in clean Imperial Gothic numerals, color-coded by certainty percentage. The first time I saw what the virus did to living tissue, I was standing in a forward observation post on the northern ridgeline overlooking the Tertius Valley. This was 11 days after planetfall. The enemy had established positions in the valley floor, entrenched around the ruins of what had been an agricultural settlement. Our artillery had been shelling them for 6 hours with conventional munitions. with minimal effect. Then the bombardment stopped, and there was a period of silence that lasted perhaps 90 seconds. I was watching through magnification binos when the virus shells began falling. They made a different sound on impact, softer, almost gentle, like glass breaking underwater. Grey mist bloomed from the impact points, expanding in perfect spheres that merged and flowed like liquid smoke. It moved against the wind. I registered that detail specifically. The mist moved against the prevailing air currents, as if it possessed intent. The enemy soldiers began dying within 20 seconds of exposure. Through the binos, magnified 12 times, I could see the process. Flesh did not simply rot, it liquefied. A man would be running, and then his legs would lose cohesion, collapsing beneath him not from injury but from sudden structural failure. Skin sloughed away like wet paper, muscle fibers separated. Bone remained intact the longest, white frameworks collapsing into puddles of what had been human beings. I counted 83 enemy casualties in the first minute. Then I stopped counting because the numbers lost meaning. The grey mist continued expanding, and everything it touched began to break down. Trees dissolved from the leaves downward. A pack animal, some local species I did not recognize, fell apart while trying to run, leaving a trail of liquefied biomass. The grass itself died, entire sections of the valley floor turning to brown slurry. The entire process took 14 minutes. Then the valley was silent and empty except for the bones and the equipment and the slowly settling mist. I lowered the binos. My hands were steady. I noted this because I expected them to shake. Inside my suit, my heart rate was elevated to 94 beats per minute, displayed helpfully on my HUD. I watched the number slowly decline back toward resting rate. Terrans was next to me in the observation post. He had vomited inside his helmet. I could hear it in his breathing, the wet rasp of partially blocked airways. He was trying to clear his rebreather intake without breaking seal. The suit's internal systems could process small amounts of biological matter, but they were not designed for it. His HUD would be flashing contamination warnings. He would have to endure it until we returned to base, until he could access a decontamination chamber. They were outside, he said, his voice thick and distorted through the vox. They weren't sealed. We're sealed. We're safe. He said it like a prayer, like repetition would make it true. I did not tell him about the casualty projections I had seen in the briefing, the percentages allocated for suit failure, for seal breaches, for the statistical certainty that some of us would be exposed regardless of precautions. I simply acknowledged his statement with a vox click and continued observing the valley, logging the data as required. Enemy position neutralized, area saturated, advance possible in 6 hours pending atmospheric dispersal. The wind shifted, and I watched the grey mist begin drifting toward our position. The tech priest had said it degraded rapidly in open atmosphere, breaking down into inert compounds within hours. I trusted this information because I had no alternative. The mist reached the base of our ridge and dissipated against the rocks like fog against a shoreline. My suit integrity remained at 100%. I checked it 4 times in as many minutes. We advanced into the valley that evening, after the atmospheric sensors registered acceptable contamination levels. Acceptable, not safe. The distinction was emphasized in the Vox briefing. We moved in standard dispersal formation, every soldier maintaining 3 meters separation. Each of us enclosed in our sealed suits, our boots crunching through the dried biomass that had been vegetation. The bones were everywhere. Human skeletons in chaos-marked armor, still arranged in combat positions, some clutching weapons that had survived the dissolution of their wielders. Animal skeletons I could not identify, and the smell, even through the suit's filtration, I could detect it, a penetrating chemical reek that made my eyes water. The suit's atmospheric analysis displayed complex hydrocarbon chains, volatile organic compounds, trace toxins at levels marked yellow on the threat assessment scale. We secured the valley without resistance because there was nothing left to resist. I documented 41 enemy positions, all now manned by skeletons. Our company suffered 0 casualties in the advance. Command logged it as a successful operation. That night, in the temporary encampment, Terrans asked me if I thought the enemy would do the same to us, use their own virus weapons in retaliation. I was performing maintenance on my suit, checking every seal, every filter coupling, every integrity indicator. The routine had already become compulsive. The briefings said they had biological weapons, I told him. Doctrine assumes they will deploy them. But we deployed first, he said. We escalated. I did not know how to explain to him that escalation was a meaningless concept in a war where both sides had already committed to total deployment. That the first use simply established the pattern that both sides would follow. That we had crossed a threshold that once crossed eliminated all positions except forward. 3 days later, the enemy deployed their own virus. Not Life Eater. Something else. Something that worked differently but achieved similar results. We were advancing on the western approaches to Hive Tertius when the shells began falling on our positions. They made the same soft breaking sound, but the mist was green instead of gray, and it moved faster, spreading like spilled liquid across the ground. I was in the third wave, approximately 400 meters behind the forward elements. I watched through my HUD's distance markers as the mist enveloped the lead squads. For perhaps 5 seconds, nothing happened. Then the Vox channels erupted with screaming. The enemy's virus worked from the inside out. It entered through any breach, any imperfection in the seals, and began consuming the victim's lungs first. Men fell to their knees, clawing at their helmets, trying to remove them even though removal meant certain death. Some succeeded in breaking their own seals in their panic and died faster for it. Others thrashed on the ground, their suits still intact, suffocating as their respiratory tissue liquefied inside their chests. The screaming lasted approximately 4 minutes. I logged the duration. Then it stopped, and we were left with 147 sealed suits lying motionless on the ground, each containing a skeleton and liquefied organic matter that slowly drained from the suit's pressure release valves. The advance halted. We established a perimeter and waited for the mist to disperse. It took longer than the Imperial virus. 6 hours instead of 3. The atmospheric sensors tracked its breakdown, displaying percentage reduction in real time, 90%, 80%, 70%. At 40% remaining concentration, Command ordered us forward, the acceptable threshold. We moved through the field of our own dead. Standard procedure was to recover the suits for decontamination and reissue, but Command had determined the risk of residual contamination was too high. We left them. 147 sealed coffins containing what had been soldiers of the Imperium, arranged in the positions where they had fallen. I recognized some of them by their ID tags, displayed on my HUD when I passed within 2 meters. Corporal Mendes, who had served 8 years. Private Holland, who had been 19. Sergeant Krast, who had survived 3 campaigns before this one. The suits preserved them perfectly. Sealed environments containing their dissolution. Terrans walked beside me through the field. He had stopped talking after the first day of the viral exchanges. His Vox discipline was perfect now. He only transmitted when required, only spoke when spoken to. Inside his helmet, I knew, he was checking his suit integrity, again and again. The same compulsion I felt. The numbers became prayers. 100%. 99%, 100% again. The sensors fluctuated within measurement tolerances, and we learned to interpret every fractional change as potential catastrophe. That night, I met the man who would matter more than any other in the time that followed. His name was Serverin, and he was a specialist in atmospheric hazard response, attached to our regiment from some other command structure I did not understand. He arrived in an enclosed transport, emerging in a suit that was different from ours, heavier, more sophisticated, with additional filtration layers and redundant seal systems. He gathered the surviving squad leaders for a briefing in a sealed command tent. The tent's atmosphere was maintained at positive pressure, double-filtered, with chemical sniffers at every entrance. Inside, we were permitted to break helmet seal, the first time in 6 days. The air tasted like heaven, processed and sterile, but breathable without mechanical assistance. Servran was older than I expected, perhaps 40 standard years, with grey threading through his dark hair and a face marked by chronic fatigue. His eyes were careful, measuring. He examined each of us in turn before speaking. "The situation has exceeded projected parameters," he said. His voice was hoarse, as if he had spent considerable time screaming or breathing contaminated air. "Both sides are deploying viral weapons without strategic limitation. Atmospheric modeling indicates total biosphere collapse within 30 to 40 days. Someone asked, I do not remember who, whether extraction was being arranged. Servan shook his head slowly. The campaign objective remains unchanged. Secure Imperial territory. Eliminate enemy presence. The planet's habitability is now secondary to strategic denial. If we cannot hold Vectris Prime, neither can the enemy." I understood then, with the clarity that comes from having all possibilities reduced to one, that we were being asked to fight for a corpse. That the planet was already dead in every meaningful sense, and we were simply determining which corpse would place the Imperial flag upon it. "The next phase will be worse," Servan continued. "As viral saturation increases, atmospheric composition will become increasingly unstable. The decomposition of biomass at this scale releases methane, hydrogen sulfide, and other volatile compounds. Ignition events are probable, perhaps inevitable." He displayed hololith projections, entire regions of the planet's atmosphere catching fire. Firestorms consuming thousands of square kilometers, temperatures sufficient to melt armor plating. The projections were marked with probability percentages: 73% likelihood within 15 days, 91% within 30. "Your suits will not protect you from sustained fire exposure," he said. "Tactical doctrine is being updated. You will learn to fight between ignition events, to recognize the atmospheric conditions that precede combustion, to seek shelter before the air burns." His tone suggested this was merely additional data to be processed and incorporated into our operational parameters. After the briefing, as we prepared to reseal our helmets, Servan approached me specifically. I do not know why he selected me. Perhaps he saw something in my face, some quality of attention or acceptance, that marked me as suitable for what he needed. "You check your seals frequently," he observed. It was not a question. "Yes," I confirmed. "How frequently?" "Every 3 to 4 minutes. He nodded, as if this confirmed some hypothesis. "You understand that the seals are the only thing keeping you alive, that your continued existence depends on maintaining integrity at all times?" "Yes." "I need soldiers who understand this. Who can teach others to maintain discipline? Most men panic or become fatalistic. You do neither." He studied me for another moment. "What is your designation?" I told him. He entered it into his data slate. "I am requesting your transfer to hazard response duties. You will accompany me on atmospheric assessment operations. The work requires prolonged suit deployment in high contamination zones. Failure means death. Are you willing?" I agreed, not because I wanted to, not because I felt brave or capable. I agreed because he had asked, and because saying no seemed impossible in the face of his careful attention. Because someone had seen me and found me suitable for something, and that had not happened often in my service. I did not know then that this decision would preserve me longer than most, that I would survive to see the atmosphere burn, that I would watch the planet die in stages over the weeks that followed. I did not know that Servan would become the measure against which I would evaluate all other human connection, brief as that connection would be. I knew only that he had offered me a purpose more specific than simply surviving, and that in this place, purpose was a rare commodity. We resealed our helmets, the hiss of pressurization, the flat taste of recycled air, the HUD flickering to life. Suit integrity, 100%. I checked it again 90 seconds later. Still 100%. The compulsion had already become permanent. The first atmospheric ignition occurred on the 19th day of the campaign. I was with Severin in an elevated observation position, 12 kilometers from the forward line, when the air caught fire. We had been tracking atmospheric composition for 6 hours, watching the chemical sensors register increasing concentrations of methane and hydrogen sulfide. The decomposition of billions of tons of organic matter was releasing gases faster than the planet's atmospheric circulation could disperse them. Severin had been documenting the accumulation in his data slate, his voice steady and clinical as he recorded measurements. Methane concentration at 4.7%, he said into his suit's recorder. Approaching lower combustibility threshold. Wind speed declining. Atmospheric mixing insufficient. Ignition probability increasing. The sky had changed color over the preceding week. What had been pale blue had shifted to gray-green, a sickly color that reminded me of infected wounds. The sunlight came through diffused and strange, casting no clear shadows. The temperature had increased by 11 degrees Celsius, heat from decomposition rising into the atmosphere, trapped by the chemical haze. I was scanning the horizon through distance optics when I saw the flash. A bright point of light, perhaps 20 kilometers distance, sudden as a lascan discharge but expanding rapidly. A sphere of orange flame goomed outward, consuming the air itself, spreading across the sky like liquid fire. Ignition event, Severin said, his voice unchanged in tone. Mark time and position. I logged the data while watching the fireball expand. It grew for perhaps 30 seconds, a perfect sphere of combustion 3 kilometers in diameter, before fragmenting into smaller burn patterns that raced along the wind currents. The fire spread in visible lines, following concentrations of flammable gas, creating a branching network of flame across the sky. The temperature reading on my HUD began climbing. 31 degrees, 34, 38. The heat was coming at us in a wave propagating faster than the visible flame. Severin was already moving, descending from the observation point toward the reinforced shelter we had established in a natural depression in the terrain. I followed, my suit's cooling systems activating automatically as the exterior temperature continued rising. 42 degrees, 47, 53. We reached the shelter, a prefabricated bunker with heat-reflective plating, and sealed ourselves inside as the first wave of fire reached our position. Through the bunker's armored observation slit, I watched the sky burn. The flames were orange and red and white, roiling across the atmosphere in patterns that seemed almost liquid. The sound penetrated even through the bunker's insulation. A roar like constant thunder, punctuated by sharper cracks as pockets of concentrated gas detonated. My exterior temperature reading peaked at 91 degrees Celsius. The suit's cooling systems were struggling, their hum audible through my helmet's acoustic pickups. Inside, I was sweating, the moisture collection system working to prevent condensation on my visor. Severin was recording everything, his helmet turned toward the observation slit, his voice maintaining the same clinical cadence as he documented the burn patterns, the duration, the atmospheric consumption rate. He narrated the apocalypse like a weather report. The fire lasted 17 minutes. Then the flammable gases were consumed, and the flames flickered out, leaving the sky darker than before, filled with black smoke that rose in massive columns. The temperature began declining. 83 degrees, 76, 68. This will repeat, Severin said, still recording. Each ignition consumes available flammable gases, but decomposition continues. Accumulation resumes next ignition in approximately 18 to 24 hours. Each cycle will be more severe as decomposition accelerates. He turned from the observation slit to look at me. I could see his face through his visor, illuminated by his HUD's glow. His expression was calm, almost peaceful. The planet is entering cascade failure, he said. Total biosphere loss within 14 days. Complete atmospheric combustion possible. We are documenting the death of a world in real time. Do you understand how rare this data is? How valuable? I understood that he found meaning in observation, that bearing witness had become his purpose. That, in the face of planetary death, he had chosen to be the one who recorded it accurately, who ensured that what was happening here would be archived, catalogued, understood by whoever might eventually read his reports. Yes, I said, because he seemed to need me to understand. Good, he said. Then we continue. We emerged from the shelter into a transformed landscape. The fire had consumed everything organic that remained on the surface. The dead vegetation, the residual biomass, even the dried bacterial gnats that had been growing on the rocks. The ground was blackened, still radiating heat. The sky was dark with smoke, blocking most of the sunlight. My suit's external lights activated automatically, cutting white beams through the haze. We returned to the forward base to find that 43 soldiers had died in the ignition event. They had been caught in the open during a patrol, too far from shelter when the fire began. Their suits had failed under sustained heat exposure, seals melting, filtration systems burning out, cooling systems overwhelmed. Inside each suit was a roasted corpse, the flesh cooked inside the armor like meat in an oven. I helped document the casualties, recording their identification tags, their last known positions, the specific failure modes of their equipment. The data would be used to improve suit design, to update tactical doctrine, to inform future operations on worlds undergoing similar collapse. The dead became data points. This was how we honored them, by learning from their failures. Terrans had survived. He found me that evening in the equipment bay where I was performing maintenance on my suit, checking every seal with compulsive precision. He had stopped checking his own suit as frequently. I had noticed this over recent days. He would go 5, sometimes 10 minutes between integrity checks. His discipline was eroding. "They're pulling back," he said. "Command is consolidating positions, abandoning the forward operating bases." As the ignition events increased in frequency, maintaining dispersed positions became untenable. Centralized locations with hardened shelters were necessary for survival. "The enemy is doing the same," Terrans continued. "We monitored their Vox traffic. They're dying just like us. The virus doesn't care which prayers you say." He laughed, a sound without humor, slightly too high-pitched. "We're killing the planet to deny it to them, and they're killing it to deny it to us. And it's working. Everyone's winning." I did not correct his analysis, though it was incomplete. Strategic denial was a valid military objective. The planet's resources would serve neither the Imperium nor Chaos, if neither could survive on its surface. This was acceptable doctrine. "Your seal is compromised," I said, pointing to his left shoulder coupling. The integrity indicator was showing yellow, 94%. Not critical, but degraded. He looked at it without much interest. "It does that, fluctuates, goes back to green eventually. It should be replaced. They're rationing replacement components. Priority goes to hazard response personnel." He meant people like me, assigned to high-risk operations with Serverin. Everyone else makes do. I tightened the coupling manually, twisting the locking ring until the indicator shifted back to green. Terrans stood passive while I worked, his arms hanging loose, his eyes focused on nothing in particular. He had the look of someone who had stopped calculating odds, who had accepted the statistical certainty of his death and was simply waiting for the specific moment to arrive. "How do you do it?" he asked while I worked. "Stay functional. You check your seals all the time, I've seen you. But you don't panic. You don't freeze. You just keep checking and keep moving." I did not have an answer that would satisfy him. The truth was that I had simply accepted the maintenance of seal integrity as my primary purpose, elevated above all other concerns. As long as my suit remained intact, I remained alive. This was a simple equation that required no faith, no hope, only vigilance. "I focus on what I can control," I said, because this seemed like something he could understand. "We can't control any of this," he said. "No. But I can control whether my seals are properly maintained." He nodded slowly, as if this made sense, though I could see in his face that it did not really help him. He needed something larger than seal maintenance to invest meaning in. I had learned to make seal maintenance sufficient. The second ignition event occurred 31 hours after the first. This time we had advance warning. Servran's atmospheric monitoring detected the rising gas concentrations and predicted the ignition point with reasonable accuracy. Warnings were transmitted across the Vox network. All personnel were ordered to shelter positions. I was with Servran in a bunker complex near the primary command post when the sky caught fire again. This ignition was larger than the first, the initial fireball spanning 7 kilometers, fragmenting into dozens of smaller burns that raced across the atmosphere in branching patterns. Through the bunker's observation equipment, I watched the flames consume the air above what had been Hive Tertius, the city I had never actually entered, now abandoned by both sides as the atmosphere became weapon. The fire burned for 32 minutes this time. Peak temperature at our location reached 107 degrees Celsius. My suit's cooling system operated at maximum capacity, barely maintaining survivable interior temperature. The heat was oppressive even through the insulation. I could feel it radiating through my suit's layers, my skin slick with sweat, my water intake increasing to compensate for dehydration. Servan documented everything with unwavering attention. His recorder captured the flame patterns, the temperature curves, the duration, the atmospheric composition before and after. He had filled 17 data slates with observations since I had begun accompanying him. Each one was encrypted and transmitted to orbital relay stations, archived in the regimental cogitator systems, forwarded to some distant administratum facility where analysts would process the data long after we were dead. Patton is accelerating, he said, reviewing his calculations after the fire subsided. Next ignition in approximately 16 hours. The cycle is compressing. Within 5 days, the ignitions will be nearly continuous. The atmosphere will enter sustained combustion. He said this with the tone of someone reporting expected results, confirming a hypothesis, as if this planetary immolation was simply the logical conclusion of factors set in motion when the first virus shell fell. Can the suits survive sustained combustion? I asked. No. Maximum heat tolerance is approximately 140 degrees Celsius for 30 minutes before catastrophic failure. Sustained atmospheric combustion will exceed 200 degrees. Nothing organic will survive on the surface. He paused, then added, "Evacuation protocols are being drafted. Assuming orbital transport can be arranged before the combustion phase begins. Assuming." The word carried significant weight. The enemy still maintained surface-to-orbit weapons. Transport ships would be vulnerable during ascent. The calculations were being made. How many soldiers could be evacuated versus how many would be lost in the attempt versus how many would die if they remained on the surface. Cost-benefit analysis with human variables. I had been in the Guard long enough to understand that when evacuation protocols were being drafted, the priority would not be individual soldiers. Command staff would be evacuated first. Essential personnel. Specialists, whose skills were valuable enough to justify the risk and resource expenditure. The remaining forces would be ordered to maintain positions until extraction became impossible, providing covering fire for those deemed worth saving. Will hazard response personnel be prioritized? I asked, meaning Servan, meaning myself as his assigned companion. The data we have collected is valuable, he said. We will be considered essential personnel. This should have provided comfort. It provided only information. I would likely survive longer than Terrans, longer than most of my original company. I would be selected for preservation while they burned. This was logical resource allocation. I felt nothing about it. No guilt, no relief, only the flat recognition of probability. The ground war had become surreal in its futility. Both sides continued operations, continued trying to hold positions and deny territory, even as the planet died beneath our feet. Enemy forces would advance on a position, we would retreat, and then the atmosphere would ignite, and both sides would shelter and survive, or not survive, and then we would emerge and resume the previous pattern. We were fighting for control of a corpse that was actively decomposing. I accompanied Serverin on an atmospheric survey of the eastern approaches 3 days after the second ignition. We traveled in an enclosed vehicle with independent atmosphere, moving through a landscape that had become alien. The vegetation was entirely gone, reduced to ash by the fires, or consumed by the viral weapons. The ground was bare rock and dust. The sky was perpetually dark now, the smoke too thick to allow sunlight through. We moved through permanent twilight, our vehicle's lights cutting through haze that swirled in strange patterns. We encountered enemy forces twice during the survey. Both times the engagements were brief and strange. We would see their lights moving through the darkness, they would see ours. Weapons would be fired, and then both parties would retreat to avoid breaching each other's suits in close combat. Killing the enemy was secondary to maintaining SEAL integrity. The planet itself was doing most of the killing now. We were just avoiding being included in the casualty count. During the second encounter, I killed a man at 40 meters with my lasgun. The shot was clean, striking his suit's chest plate, burning through the armor and the layers beneath. I saw the exact moment his SEAL was compromised, a puff of interior atmosphere venting into the toxic exterior, and then his body's sudden convulsion as the contaminated air entered his respiratory system. He fell, clawing at his helmet, and died within seconds. I felt nothing about this except confirmation that my weapon remained functional. Servan logged the encounter in his data slate, noting the combat action, and we continued the survey. The dead enemy soldier remained where he had fallen, another sealed suit containing dissolution, indistinguishable from the Imperial dead, except for the markings on his armor. We reached the survey point, a ridge overlooking what had been agricultural lowlands, and Serverin deployed his atmospheric sensors. I maintained perimeter security, scanning the darkness for movement, checking my suit integrity every 3 minutes. 100%. Always 100%. The compulsion was a comfort now, a ritual that provided structure. The sensor readings were worse than Serverin's models had predicted. Methane concentration at 7.2%, hydrogen sulfide at 3.1%, multiple volatile organic compounds accumulating. The decomposition was accelerating as more biomass broke down, as the temperature increased, as the cycle fed itself. Ignition in approximately 4 hours, Servan said. We need to return to base. We drove back through the darkness, racing against the invisible countdown in the atmosphere. The vehicle's atmospheric sensors tracked the rising gas concentrations in real time, displaying the increasing ignition probability on a screen that updated every 30 seconds. 68%. 73%? 79%? We reached the bunker complex with 52 minutes to spare. The ignition began earlier than calculated. Atmospheric modeling was becoming less precise as the system entered chaotic collapse. I was sealing the bunker entrance when the sky flashed orange. This ignition was different from the previous events. The fire started in multiple locations simultaneously, dozens of separate combustion points that merged into a continuous blanket of flame. The sky became fire from horizon to horizon, a solid ceiling of orange and red that pressed down on the planet's surface like the roof of an oven. The temperature climbed faster than before. 112 degrees, 126, 138. My suit's cooling system was screaming, overworked, beginning to fail under sustained demand. Inside, the temperature was rising despite the cooling. I could feel it, the heat penetrating through layers of insulation, my skin burning, my vision beginning to blur from dehydration and heat stress. Serverin's suit was handling the heat better. His specialized equipment had superior cooling capacity. He continued recording while I focused on managing my suit's failing systems, manually adjusting power distribution, diverting energy from non-essential functions to cooling, watching my temperature indicators climb toward critical thresholds. The fire burned for 1 hour and 43 minutes. My suit's interior temperature peaked at 51 degrees Celsius. I came close to heat stroke, my thoughts becoming fragmented, my hands clumsy on the suit's controls. Servan was talking to me. I could hear his voice through the Vox, steady and calm, telling me to regulate my breathing, to reduce my activity level, to trust the cooling system. I focused on his voice because it provided something external to anchor to, something other than the heat and the failing numbers on my HUD. When the fire finally subsided, my suit's cooling system had suffered permanent damage. The efficiency was reduced by 40%. The components stressed beyond repair with available resources. Serverin assessed the damage and requisitioned a replacement suit for me, using his authority as hazard response specialist to bypass the standard supply rationing. "You will not survive the next sustained burn in that suit," he said, examining the readouts. "The cooling system will fail completely. Interior temperature will exceed survivable limits." The replacement suit arrived 6 hours later, delivered by supply servitor. It was newer than my original, with upgraded seals and enhanced filtration, but the cooling system was only marginally better. Serverin helped me transfer my equipment, checking each component as I installed it, ensuring perfect integration. "The combustion phase is beginning," he said while working. "Continuous ignition within 48 hours. Evacuation protocols are being implemented. We are scheduled for extraction in the second wave, 73 hours from now." 73 hours. 3 more days of surviving the burning atmosphere, of sheltering during ignition events that would become more frequent and severe, of maintaining seal integrity while the air outside reached temperatures sufficient to melt ceramite. "What about the others?" I asked, meaning Terrans, meaning my original company, meaning the thousands of soldiers who would not be classified as essential personnel, 4th wave or later, Serverin said. "Depending on transport availability. 4th wave, if there was a 4th wave. If sufficient transport could be secured, if the orbital approaches remained viable, if the surface installations could maintain operation long enough." The unspoken understanding was that many soldiers would not be evacuated at all, that they would remain on Vectris Prime as it entered terminal combustion, that they would die in their sealed suits as the atmosphere burned continuously and the surface temperature climbed beyond survival. I should have felt something about this. Guilt at being prioritized, grief for those who would be abandoned, anger at the calculations that determined worth. I felt only the flat recognition of reality. The Imperium made cost-benefit determinations. Some assets were preserved, others were expended. This was doctrine. This was function. Serverin sealed the final coupling on my new suit and checked the integrity indicators. All green, 100% across every metric. "Good," he said. "You are mission capable. We have 3 more survey operations to complete before evacuation. The data collection must continue until the last possible moment." I acknowledged this and followed him to the briefing for the next survey mission. My old suit was left in the equipment bay, tagged for salvage, its damaged cooling system marked for analysis. It had kept me alive for 28 days in an atmosphere that had killed thousands. Now it was just equipment, replaceable. Its service complete. The pattern continued. Survey operations between ignition events, the windows of opportunity becoming shorter as the fires increased in frequency. Serverin drove us through the darkness, through the smoke and ash, deploying sensors and recording data while I maintained security and checked my seals. 100%. Every 3 minutes. The ritual that kept me functional. We encountered fewer enemy forces during this period. Their casualties had been as severe as ours, their evacuation efforts equally desperate. The ground war had effectively ended, both sides retreating to defendable positions with shelter capacity, conserving resources, waiting for extraction. The planet itself had won the contest, had defeated both armies through simple atmospheric chemistry. I found Terrans on the 26th day in the barracks section of the command bunker. He was sitting alone, his helmet unsealed. The bunker's atmosphere was still maintained at survivable levels, though the filtration systems were straining under the load of processing the increasingly toxic exterior air that infiltrated through every imperfect seal. His face was gaunt, the skin around his eyes dark with fatigue. His suit was dirty, the exterior caked with ash that he had not bothered to clean. His equipment was maintained adequately but not compulsively. Good enough to function, not good enough to reflect pride or care. They posted the evacuation list, he said when he saw me. Fourth wave, projected departure in 96 hours, subject to transport availability. He smiled without humor. Subject to, that means maybe. Probably not. I sat next to him, our suits making dull thuds against the metal bench. The barracks were nearly empty. Most personnel were either on duty or sleeping in their assigned rest cycles, squeezing what rest they could into the gaps between ignition events. "Your second wave," Terrence said. It was not a question. Hazard response gets priority. Yes. Good. That's good. Someone should survive who can tell people what happened here, what we did. He was quiet for a moment, then added, "We killed a planet. Both sides. We killed it together. That should be recorded." "Sovereign is recording everything," I said. "The data will be archived." "Data." Terrence laughed. The same, slightly too high sound. "Yeah, will be data. Numbers in a casualty report. Acceptable losses in a strategic denial operation." He looked at me, his eyes focusing with sudden intensity. "Do you think it was worth it? Killing everything? Making sure neither side could have it?" I did not have an answer that would satisfy him. The strategic calculation had been made at levels far above my rank. Whether it was correct was not something I was qualified to assess. I knew only that it had been done, that the consequences were irreversible, that assigning worth to the decision would not change the outcome. "I don't know," I said, because this was honest. "Yeah," Terrence said. "Me neither." The final ignition event before my scheduled evacuation began 37 hours later. The atmospheric sensors detected critical gas concentrations at multiple points simultaneously. The warnings came across all Vox channels: sustained combustion imminent, all personnel to hardened shelters, seal all exterior access, emergency protocol active. I was with Sovereign in the primary command bunker when the sky caught fire and did not stop burning. The combustion began at the horizon and spread inward, a wave of flame that consumed the atmosphere in rolling patterns of orange and red and white. Within minutes, the entire visible sky was burning, and the temperature began climbing without limit. 140 degrees, 160, 180. The bunker's insulation was designed for this, but the heat penetrated anyway, radiating through layers of ceramite and rock red, turning the interior into an oven. My suit's cooling system was working at maximum capacity, barely maintaining survivable interior temperature. The hum of its operation was loud enough to hear over the Vox channel's background static. Sovereign was recording, always recording, his voice steady as he narrated the atmospheric composition, the flame patterns, the temperature curve. His suit was handling the heat better than mine, but even his systems were being stressed toward failure. I could see the strain in his posture, the way he held himself rigid to minimize movement, to reduce heat generation. The fire burned for 6 hours without stopping. The temperature outside exceeded 230 degrees Celsius. Multiple shelters across the base complex failed, their seals melting, their insulation breaking down, their interior atmospheres cooking the soldiers inside. I monitored the casualty reports on the command Vox, listening to the dry recitation of positions lost, personnel deceased, structural integrity compromised. Terrence was in Bunker 7 when it failed. I saw it on the casualty list, his designation appearing among the 43 soldiers who died when the bunker's seals gave way and superheated atmosphere flooded the interior. The report specified that death was rapid, thermal exposure causing immediate incapacitation, respiratory systems failing within seconds. This was meant to be comforting, I think, that the dying was quick. I felt something when I saw his designation on the list. Not grief exactly, not shock. Something closer to recognition. He had been present, had existed in proximity to me for 31 days, and now he was absent. The specific space he had occupied in the world was empty. I registered this absence the way one registers a missing component in a system. awareness of what should be present and is not. Servrin noticed me looking at the casualty list. He said nothing, simply placed his hand on my shoulder, the closest thing to comfort available when both people are sealed in environment suits. The gesture lasted 3 seconds. Then he returned to his recording. The sustained combustion continued for 18 hours total. When it finally began to subside, the atmosphere had changed fundamentally. The oxygen concentration had dropped by 12%, consumed by the burning. Carbon dioxide had spiked to 7%. The temperature remained above 140 degrees. The planet's surface was now genuinely uninhabitable, even without the viral contamination. Even with perfect seals, prolonged survival was no longer possible. The evacuation began immediately. First wave departed 12 hours after the fire subsided. Command staff, strategic assets, critical personnel who held knowledge or skills deemed irreplaceable. I watched the transports launch from the command bunker's exterior monitoring system, their engines burning bright against the dark, smoke-filled sky, climbing toward orbit through air that was still hot enough to stress their heat shielding. 2 transports were destroyed during ascent. Enemy surface-to-orbit weapons, still operational despite everything, still trying to deny us evacuation even as they attempted their own. I watched the impacts on the monitoring screen, the bright flashes of void shields failing, the debris tumbling back toward the surface. Approximately 200 personnel lost per transport, 400 deaths to deny the enemy even partial victory. The second wave was scheduled to depart in 23 hours. Servrin was compiling his final data reports, ensuring every observation was transmitted, every measurement archived, every aspect of the planet's death properly documented. He worked without pause, his attention completely absorbed in the task. I performed maintenance on my suit, checking every seal with compulsive precision, preparing for the evacuation sequence. The thought of ascending through the toxic atmosphere, of depending entirely on the suit's integrity during the hours-long transit to orbit, triggered my checking compulsion into heightened frequency. Every 90 seconds now. 100%. 100%. 100%. Come with me, Servant said, interrupting my maintenance. Final survey. I need to document the surface conditions for the archive. This was not scheduled, this was not necessary for evacuation, but he was hazard response specialist, and I was assigned to his operations. And when he gave an instruction, I followed it. We departed the bunker complex in an enclosed vehicle, moving through landscape that had become utterly alien. The sustained combustion had transformed everything. The rock itself had been scorched, changed in color and texture by extreme heat. Nothing moved except ash blown by superheated wind. The darkness was absolute, the smoke layer so thick that no sunlight penetrated at all. We existed in a bubble of artificial light, the vehicle's floods illuminating perhaps 30 meters of dead terrain. Servrin drove to the ridge overlooking Tertius Valley, the place where I had witnessed the first viral deployment 34 days ago. The valley that had been full of life, then full of death, then burned empty. We stopped at the observation point, and Servrin activated his external sensors, recording the atmospheric composition, the temperature, the ambient radiation levels. "This is what we did," he said quietly, watching the data flow across his data slate. "The Imperium and its enemies. We murdered a world to deny each other its resources, and we will do it again, on other worlds, in other systems. Because the strategic calculus determines that denial is preferable to loss." He turned to look at me, his face visible through his visor, illuminated by his HUD's glow. His eyes were tired beyond measure, carrying the weight of witnessing, of recording, of bearing testimony to catastrophe. "You understand why I needed to document everything? Why the data matters?" His voice carried intensity that his earlier clinical tone had masked. "Because someone must acknowledge what was done here. Someone must ensure that this is not simply erased, forgotten, reduced to a line in an administrative report. These deaths happened. This world died. That must be recorded with precision and archived with permanence." "Yes," I said, because I did understand. Because in a system that reduced individuals to numbers and worlds to strategic assets, the act of precise documentation was a form of resistance. Not resistance against the system itself. That was impossible, but resistance against the erasure of details, the loss of specificity, the reduction of catastrophe to abstraction. When we reach orbit, these records will be transmitted to the administrative archives, Serverin continued. They will be classified, restricted, probably never accessed by anyone except analysts calculating future operations. But they will exist. Permanent, specific, true. He finished his recording and we sat in silence, looking out over the dead valley. I checked my seal integrity. 100%. Serverin did not comment on the compulsion. He understood it, perhaps better than I did. We returned to the base for final evacuation preparation. The second wave transports arrived in orbit on schedule, beginning their descent through the toxic atmosphere. I stood in the embarkation bay with 43 other evacuees, all of us sealed in our suits, waiting for clearance to board. Serverin was beside me, his data lates secured in reinforced cases, his suit's integrity at 100%. His final task was complete. The testimony was recorded. Now we would be preserved to continue recording elsewhere, on other worlds, in other campaigns. The transport touched down and extended its boarding ramp. The bay's atmosphere had already failed, the filtration systems overwhelmed by the toxic exterior air. We moved through hard vacuum conditions, dependent entirely on our suits. I followed Serverin up the ramp, checking my seals with each step. 100%. 100%. Inside the transport, we were directed to acceleration couches in the cargo bay. No amenities, no comfort. This was emergency evacuation protocol, maximizing personnel capacity over all other concerns. I secured myself in the restraint harness and felt the transport's engines begin their ascent cycle. The launch was violent, the transport fighting through thick atmosphere laden with particulates and toxic compounds. The frame shook with sustained stress, and I could hear the hull plating groaning under thermal load. My HUD displayed exterior temperature climbing as we passed through the hot atmospheric layers. 160 degrees, 173, 189. The transport's heat shielding was adequate, but barely. Enemy fire began at 11,000 meters altitude. I felt the impacts transmitted through the hull, felt the void shields activating to disperse incoming energy. The transport jinked and weaved, attempting evasive maneuvers while maintaining its ascent vector. Someone screamed over the Vox channel, brief and sharp, then cut off. A hit had penetrated somewhere, breached someone's suit, killed them during the ascent. Then we were through the engagement envelope, climbing toward orbit, the fire ceasing as we exceeded enemy weapon range. The shaking continued but diminished as the atmosphere thinned. My exterior temperature reading began declining. 147 degrees, 123, 98. We reached orbit 17 minutes after launch. Through the cargo bay's small viewports, I could see Vectrus Prime below us, a sphere of dark gray-green, wreathed in black smoke that covered most of the surface. Occasional bright points marked ongoing combustion events, the atmosphere still burning in isolated regions. From orbit, the death was almost beautiful, abstract, reduced to visual patterns of light and shadow. The transport docked with an orbital evacuation carrier, a massive vessel designed for personnel transfer operations. We were processed through decontamination, our suits subjected to chemical baths and high-temperature sterilization to remove any trace of viral contamination, before being permitted to unseal. The air in the carrier tasted like metal and recycled sweat, but it was breathable without mechanical assistance. I removed my helmet for the first time in 37 days. The sensation was overwhelming. Unfiltered sensory input, air moving across my face, the ability to touch my own skin. I stood trembling in the decontamination bay, my hands shaking, the physical response to survival finally manifesting now that the immediate threat had ended. Serverin unsealed beside me. His face was haggard, marked by the prolonged suit deployment, but his expression carried satisfaction. The data had been preserved. The testimony was complete. He had accomplished his purpose. Evacuation continuing for 72 hours, he said, checking the data slate that had been provided by carrier personnel. All waves will be completed if enemy fire does not intensify. Estimated survivor rate, 63% of deployed personnel. 63%, 11,000 soldiers had been deployed to Vectrus Prime. Approximately 7,000 would survive evacuation. 4,000 would die on the surface or during ascent, killed by the planet they had helped murder or by the enemy they had failed to defeat. I thought about Terrans, sealed in his suit in the ruins of Bunker 7, cooked by superheated atmosphere. His death recorded as data point in the casualty statistics. I thought about the 147 soldiers in my company who had died in the first viral attack, their dissolution preserved in sealed suits. I thought about all the deaths I had witnessed, documented, logged as part of my function. The campaign is classified as strategic success, Serverin continued, reading from the data slate. Enemy forces eliminated. Imperial territorial claim maintained. Planet quarantined pending atmospheric stabilization. He looked up at me. Strategic success. That is how this will be recorded. Victory. The planet below was dead. Every native organism exterminated. Every ecosystem collapsed. The atmosphere toxic and burning. The surface temperature far beyond habitability. The estimated recovery time was calculated in centuries, minimum 400 years before natural processes might restore basic habitability. Assuming no intervention, we had fought a war to save Vectrus Prime from chaos. We had succeeded. The enemy was eliminated, their claim denied. The Imperium maintained control of the system. We had saved a corpse. I stood in the decontamination bay, unsealed, breathing air that tasted like metal, and felt the full weight of recognition settle over me. This was the Imperium's mathematics. This was how victories were calculated. The planet's life was irrelevant compared to the strategic value of denial. 4,000 Imperial deaths were acceptable losses compared to allowing the enemy to claim the system. The long-term habitability was secondary to immediate control, and I had participated. I had maintained my seals, followed my orders, killed when required, survived when possible. I had been part of the mechanism that murdered a world, and my reward for service was preservation while others died. Serverin placed his hand on my shoulder again, the same gesture of insufficient comfort. "The testimony is complete," he said quietly. "The data is archived. What happened on Vectrus Prime will be recorded with accuracy. That is what we can do. That is what we did." I nodded, accepting this as the only meaning available. In a system that reduced worlds to assets and lives to numbers, the act of precise recording was the only resistance possible. Not resistance that changed outcomes, not resistance that prevented future Vectrus Primes. Simply resistance against erasure, against the loss of details, against the abstraction of catastrophe into statistics. The evacuation continued below us. Third-wave transports descending through toxic atmosphere, ascending with their cargo of survivors. Fourth wave launching, attempting to extract the lowest priority personnel before time ran out. Some succeeded. Some were destroyed during ascent, their crews and passengers dying within sight of salvation. On the planet's surface, an estimated 2,000 soldiers remained, waiting for evacuation that would never come. As the 72-hour window closed, they were left behind, sealed in their suits, sheltering in bunkers with failing life support, watching their oxygen reserves decline towards zero. They would die slowly, suffocating inside their sealed environment suits. Or they would choose faster death by unsealing and breathing the toxic atmosphere. Either way, they would die on the planet they had died to save. The carrier departed orbit once all possible evacuations were complete. As we transitioned to warp, I watched Vectrus Prime disappear from the viewports, a dead sphere, quarantined and abandoned, its death documented with precision in Serverin's 17 datalates. I checked my suit one final time before it was taken for equipment storage. Suit integrity, 100%. It had kept me alive through 37 days in conditions that had killed thousands. Now it would be cleaned, repaired, reissued to another soldier for another campaign. The compulsion to check it would continue, even though I no longer wore it. Every 3 minutes, my hand would move toward the integrity indicator that was no longer there, checking for the number that had become prayer. 100%. Always 100%. Until the moment it was not, and everything ended. Servran found me in the carrier's observation deck 3 days into warp transit. He carried a data slate containing the final casualty reports and strategic assessment of the Vectress Prime campaign. Official conclusion, he said, displaying the document. Strategic success. Enemy eliminated. Territory secured. Acceptable losses. Recommended doctrine for similar situations in future operations. I read the summary. The deaths were quantified, categorized, analyzed for lessons learned. The viral deployment was assessed as tactically effective. The atmospheric combustion was noted as complicating factor, but not insurmountable obstacle. The extended suit deployment was evaluated for equipment improvements in future campaigns. Everything that had happened on Vectress Prime, the dissolving flesh, the burning sky, the slow suffocation in failing bunkers, was reduced to procedural recommendations and equipment specifications. The planet's death was a data point. The 4,000 casualties were a number. The strategic denial was validated as correct doctrine. "This is what I will carry," Servran said quietly. The knowledge that I documented it accurately ensured the testimony was complete and watched it be reduced to this. He gestured at the data slate. Strategic success. Acceptable losses. Recommended procedure. He looked at me with eyes that had witnessed planetary death and found meaning in observation. "We will do this again," he said, "on other worlds. I will document those deaths too, with precision, with accuracy. Because someone must ensure that the details are not lost. Even if those details change nothing, even if the testimony is immediately abstracted into doctrine, someone must record what actually happened." "Yes," I said, because I understood. Because I would continue checking seals that were no longer there, maintaining vigilance against threats that were not immediate, carrying the compulsion that had kept me alive when thousands died. We stood together in the observation deck, watching the warp's unnatural colors flow past the viewports. 2 survivors carrying the weight of testimony that would change nothing and meant everything. Vectress Prime was dead. We had killed it to save it. This was strategic success. The Imperium would call us victors. We knew what we were, and the compulsion remained. Every 3 minutes, my hand moved toward the integrity indicator that was no longer there, checking for the number that had become the only certainty in a system that converted worlds into corpses and called it victory. 100%, always 100%, until the seal breaks and the atmosphere floods in and the dissolution begins. Until then, we survive, we document, we testify. We check our seals and continue forward, carrying the weight of strategic success. This is what it means to fight for the Imperium. This is what it costs to win.